Message on perspective.
All right. Yeah, we're going to look at verses 12 through 30 of the first chapter of Philippians, talking about perspective. So there's kind of some overarching themes that run through this section, and Paul is kind of sharing more specifically about some of the hardships he has faced and is facing. But yet, when he's talking about that writing about it to the Philippians, the idea of joy comes up 3 times, the word joy or rejoice in this section, which makes us ask the question of how could he be joyful and rejoice with all these bad things happening to him and around him? And maybe we could ask ourselves the same question, if he can do that, well, how can I do that? So as he writes, it seems like he has in mind to take the Philippians' perspective on what he himself has going on and change that a little bit, and so that they could see what he's going through differently. So that way, if they encounter similar difficulties and hardships, maybe they would be prepared to face those with a different perspective as well, and in a way that's healthy, and in a way that actually enhances their faith and their witness to Jesus rather than just undermining it. And the same goes for us too, that we could learn from Paul and how he sees suffering, being treated spitefully. He talks about that, and questioning what the future holds for him. How can we face that in a way, with a new perspective that is ultimately like his and like Jesus's? So you've probably heard the phrase, get over yourself, before. And that was kind of my title for this. What's the perspective that we should have? It should be, get over yourself. What does that mean, in your experience? If you had to say that to someone, or if someone said it to you, get over yourself. What is that? What are you really saying in that? And there was kind of 2 ways that I thought about it, more than likely. One would be if you're saying it to someone or receiving it as someone who's acting in a boastful way, you're really impressed with who you are, what you've done, or something like that, and trying to be brought down a notch. Someone who sees their merits as maybe excessive, and they just need a reality check, a new perspective. And other times, I think it's someone who might be telling you about just how bad they have it and how tough their life is. And not to make little of other people's hardships and struggles and challenges, but I think we all do that. I myself, things can go on in my life, and just because they're so close to me, it seems like the end of the world at times. And I need someone to tell me, look, it could be so much worse. You need to get over yourself. And so that's the idea, to see it from a different perspective that way. And as I read through this chunk, I felt like that was kind of the impression that I had, that something that Paul had learned from Jesus, that the gospel had impressed upon him to do for himself, and that he realized the sooner and the better the Philippians could do that as well, the better off they were going to be for it as well. So at one point, I had heard about, there were some T-shirts that kind of circulated around his house, and that's what they said on them, get over yourself. And I thought, man, can you imagine just wearing a T-shirt that just looked like that? I was like, one, if I saw someone wearing that, I'd be incredibly off-put, and I couldn't bring myself to do that. That's so arrogant. And then I was told that it was printed on the shirts like this. And the reason why it was like that was so the person wearing it could look down and see, I need to get over myself. It wasn't a reminder for everyone else. It was a reminder for them. And I just feel that myself. I need that kind of a reminder. Whether we're thinking too highly of ourselves or having too low a view of ourselves or our circumstances, we could probably just stand to think less about ourselves. And I think that's really what I mean when I say get over yourself, and what I think Paul was really trying to communicate here as well. We have these notions about self-care, thinking or being told that if we take care of ourselves the right way, if we focus on ourselves enough, we're going to be happy, or we're going to be better for it. But I think we could do ourselves just as much good, maybe even more, by not thinking so much about ourselves. Not that we should give up caring for ourselves in valuable ways, but just not consider ourselves as the center of the universe and the world around us, to open up our eyes to a new perspective, to see more than just ourselves. So as I'm going through this passage, there's some things that I think changed in Paul's life as he learned to get over himself. And I think those kind of come clear in these sections here. So I'm going to focus on a few of those. So I'm going to start with verse 12 here. I don't know if the screen's working. It should be 12 through, yeah. So he says, now I want you to know. Oh, but I can't read it back there, and it's going to be different. So I'm going to read it off of here, as weird as that may be. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have been confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. So, getting over himself, it fixed Paul's focus. He tells them that his circumstances, which were being imprisoned and held in Rome for years, those circumstances actually have brought about progress in the gospel. And I think at the heart of this, he really wanted them to know that seemingly bad circumstances, God can still use those to bring about good. He was imprisoned briefly in Philippi when he started the church there. So I imagine they were aware of the opposition that they could face firsthand. And maybe they were facing that already. Maybe this was a way to prepare them for when that did come, that when bad things seem to be happening, that they would have the perspective that this is not all bad. God can still use this for good. And he says the gospel was progressing through his imprisonment. How could that be possible? If Paul had been focused on all the adversity that he had, he may have just thrown up his hands and said, like, oh man, I'm imprisoned. Like, there's nothing I can do about this now. There's nothing I can do to move the gospel forward. I'm just going to have to wait until things get better. But that's not how he saw it. Instead, he saw the opportunity to do things in spite of the adversity, and he made the most of his circumstances. So he was sent away to Rome for trial, and he preached along the way. And he mentioned specifically that Christ has become well known to the palace guard. And in Acts 28, it mentions that when he gets to Rome, he's allowed to stay by himself, but he always has this soldier that kind of guards him like all the time, or a soldier. And so you get this idea that like there was this palace guard, this group of people that kind of rotated through, and someone was watching Paul and keeping track of him day in and day out. And you talk about a captive audience. Like if there's someone who's literally its job is to stand there and watch you all day long, like, well, I guess they're going to hear about Jesus, every single one of them, all day long. That was the mentality he had. He was focused on what he could do and not what he couldn't. So he shares that others have been encouraged by this in a similar way to speak the gospel without fear, which I was thinking through that and was like, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Someone hearing like, oh wow, Paul is imprisoned and got sent away for sharing the gospel. Man, I'm so much more encouraged now to go and share myself. Like it seems like you'd be more hesitant in that situation. But I thought about a time when I was in his house and there was a guy who did a lot of impressive things who lived in the campus house at the time, and so he kind of became notorious for different things. And so me and some of the other guys there, we were talking about him, and it came up that like, oh, do you remember that he used to, every winter break, like the month of winter break, he would just take, with the time off, and he would read his Bible cover to cover in that month. And it was like, man, that's crazy. That would take a lot of time, a lot of effort. That would be hard. Maybe worth it. But so hearing about that, like I'd never thought about that, but I realized like his break is the same as mine. I might as well give it a shot. And I think that's probably what came about because of what Paul was doing. It was like, well, if Paul can do it, then I guess we can too. And they went from considering it to be too costly or too risky to share their faith to not only being possible for them, but worthwhile. And I think this just goes to show that surrounding ourselves with people who are pursuing Christ in significant ways is just so encouraging. And we can be somebody who is going after Christ, and that can indirectly challenge and encourage others to do the same. I never had a conversation with that person. They never came up to me and were like, hey, you should really try and do this, try and read your Bible over winter break or anything like that. It was just hearing about their faithfulness and their commitment and love for the Lord that inspired me. So that can be something that we can do too. The next section, verse 15, says, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this, I rejoice. So he got over comparing himself with others. Maybe you've heard the saying, comparison is the thief of joy. And so in this increasing courage of people to share the gospel, he says there were people doing it for a variety of different reasons, and some of them were more honorable than others. And he talks about these people who seem to be preaching and see it as a competition of sorts, and they wanted to get better than Paul and have more significance than Paul. And they thought that his imprisonment gave them this clear advantage to make some headway in that. It made me think of like Monopoly. It's like he got the do not pass go, do not collect $200, go straight to jail. And they just got full run of the board, and they could really make some progress while he was just in jail. But what they didn't realize was that Paul didn't seem to care a whole lot. He kind of saw himself as they were on the same team here. So he didn't have that competitive spirit in ministry. And it's not that he didn't have ambition like at all. It's clear that he did. But he didn't have selfish ambition like they did. He was just there to make the most of whatever situation he was in and realized that nothing was going to hinder God's work, not himself being in prison or not the false motives of these other people. So they were hoping that comparison would come in and take his joy, but it didn't, and it doesn't need to take ours either. God was clearly using the circumstances for good, and he mentions that some, seeing the value of proclaiming the gospel, even if it meant imprisonment, went out preaching out of love. So we can learn from, we can encourage, and even imitate others, as I kind of described I have before, and it seems like some were doing for Paul here. But that's not the same. There's a difference between that and the comparison that's built on fear, insecurity, and self-preservation that was the motive of some of these folks. So picking up at verse 18, he says, yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that Actually, I'm going to read off here. Sorry. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, that what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Next slide. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. So Paul had found his purpose. He spoke about his circumstances turning out for his deliverance, and he may have meant his immediate deliverance from his immediate circumstances of being imprisoned, that he thought he was going to get out of that, or he may have meant eternally, he was going to be executed because he was imprisoned. That would be the result, and he would go to be with Jesus. But seeing that he seemed confident that he was going to go return to the Philippians, we could say he probably anticipated both of those things to be his deliverance. And he was sure that what God was doing, either way, was going to work out for good. At one point, it was a couple of years ago now, but the brakes on my car quit working. And so I tried to fix it myself, and I, replaced one part that I thought would fix the problem, and it didn't. And I thought, that's no good. So I thought, well, maybe it's this part. So I replaced that part, and that didn't work either. And just kind of went down the line. And I generally enjoy working on my own vehicles, but there's nothing, to me, more frustrating than taking all the time and the effort and the expense to replace things on your car, having no clue if what you're doing is going to make any difference at all in the problem. That is just maddening to be well, here I am, a few hours deep, and this might not work. And that's so frustrating to me. But I don't think Paul had that same frustration. He was confident that what God was doing and what he was doing through the Lord's work in him, it was going to work out. And when we are obediently following Jesus, we can be sure that God is using our lives for his glory. And Paul trusted God's plan. And also he mentions trusting in the power of the people's prayers to bring that about. His trust in God's work didn't exempt him from doing work himself, though. He mentions later in this letter that God's work is actually what inspires us to get to work ourselves. He says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. And Paul, what was motivated him, his work, his purpose in life was Christ, is the way he explains it in verse 21. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. What a perspective to have on both life and death, all wrapped up in serving, growing closer to, and making much of Christ. And I just wanted to focus on the idea of life in that statement, that life to him meant being fruitful and serving both God and others. And I think we often think of dying for something as being the ultimate sacrifice. And thankfully, we don't live in a place where we often have to think of having the concern about dying for our faith in Christ. But we do live in a place where we have reason to think about what it means for us to live for Christ. If we had to fill in that blank that I left in your notes there, for to me to live is something. I think myself and maybe many of us too are often tempted to put our own name in that. For to me, to live is Adam. Yes, to die sounds like gain. I would love to go and be with Jesus, but to live, that's my life. That's for me. That's the mentality that we can have. And Paul seems to say that living for Jesus is just as true a sacrifice as dying for Jesus. And how he describes that he is participating presently in our lives, in his life, in the story of Jesus. Living for Christ, or having, as he kind of describes it in the next section, conduct fit for the gospel. So verse 27, this is the last part of the chapter here. He says, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in the one Spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that you will be destroyed, that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. So conduct fit for the gospel. He says, essentially, you are citizens of the kingdom of God, and you should behave like good citizens, citizens worthy of the gospel of Christ. And like Randy mentioned last week, Philippi was this wealthy Roman city whose residents would have prided themselves in the honor and the privilege of being Romans. And also, he mentioned that many being former soldiers, they would have realized that in some way, the reputation of their country and their king rested on them and how people saw them and their conduct. And Paul seems to remind the Philippian believers of the same truth for them, that they are citizens of the kingdom of Jesus as their king, and their conduct represents Jesus and that kingdom in the world around them. So our allegiance is to Jesus, and before anything else, and we look to him as our model for our own behavior. He mentions things like they were not to be stagnant, but they were to strive for progress in the gospel, and that they were to work together and serve one another, just as Paul has served them. And then in the end of this chapter, he mentions how it's granted to them not only to believe in Jesus, but also to suffer for his sake. And he talks about it like some kind of a privilege of sorts, like it's granted to them. That word stuck out to me. And again, I was thinking, like, as retired soldiers in Philippi here, that probably seemed pretty clear to them that believing in the cause of the one you serve means that you would be fighting for that same cause. Like, if you get behind the cause of the leader of the country, of the Roman emperor or whatever, it's not just like giving him a thumbs up, like, nice work, go ahead. They were behind him in a way that meant their activity was linked to that cause. And when we think about being like Jesus, it means the same for us, being willing to step into the suffering and the conflict that in the same way that Jesus experienced. Conflict, the word he uses here, was a word for an athletic contest. And Paul often uses these athletic metaphors in his letters. He uses another one later in chapter 3, I believe. And he says this to communicate to them the idea that, like, this is going to be hard work at times. It's going to require things like consistency, endurance, working together. But he urged them to do those things and to get over being comfortable in order to grow and advance the cause of the gospel. And really, Paul saw his life as this mini reenactment of Jesus. And he saw being a Christian, a follower of Jesus, as seeing our own story and our own lives as this lived expression and example of Jesus' story, of Jesus who got over himself, who endured life and death to bring us together and to bring us to God. That's how Jesus saw his life, and how he seems to be telling the Philippians how they should see their lives as well. And I think that's really what we're going to see in chapter 2 as Paul's example and his ultimate motivation, and our ultimate example and motivation as well. So just to wrap this up, I had a couple questions at the bottom of the notes there to reflect on. How might God be calling each of us to have a different perspective in our own lives and our own circumstances? And what would it look like for me to do just this, to get over myself? Lord, thank you for this letter that we have to the Philippian church, God. Help us to understand it well, God. Help us to have the same perspective as Jesus. God, to consider him and the way that he set himself aside for the sake of others, for the sake of us, and for the sake of the things that God wanted most. And Lord, may we live in much of the same way, and help us to do so. I pray this in your name. Amen.
Would you please stand?